3 bullets. That was what it took to put the most dangerous man on the eastern seaboard flat on his back, in a sterile room, hooked to machines he could not command, breathing air he had not earned on his own. Room 714 sat at the end of the trauma ward. 2 men stood outside the door, suits too sharp for a hospital, eyes sweeping the corridor in practiced arcs that missed nothing. They did not belong here. Neither did the man inside. Soren Dravanis lay still, not peaceful. Men like him did not look peaceful, even unconscious. Stripped of his coat, his watch, the weight of a name that had made entire districts fall silent, something remained. A tension in the jaw, a restraint coded into the body itself, as though even in this state it understood that weakness was to be endured, never shown. The machines beeped, steady, indifferent. 4 hours ago, that heart had been failing. 4 hours ago, blood had soaked through the hands of the woman who now stood in his doorway, reading his chart like it belonged to a stranger. Dr. Marin Calvert did not enter immediately. She stood at the threshold, the chart angled in front of her, like a shield she did not realize she was holding. She had saved his life. That fact sat in her chest like a stone she had not decided whether to swallow or spit out. 4 hours in the operating room, pulling metal fragments from tissue that shredded at the slightest wrong pressure. Not once had she faltered, had not hesitated, had not allowed a single tremor, because the moment recognition overrode training, he would have died on her table. She almost let him. Not truly. Not in any way that crossed the line between thought and action, but the impulse had flickered, dark and unbidden, in the half-second between seeing his face on the gurney and reaching for the scalpel. Something inside her had gone very still, the same stillness that had swallowed her once before, in a doorway she had spent 6 years trying to forget. Then training took over. She operated. She was precise. She was excellent. And she saved the man who had destroyed her without anyone in that room knowing the war happening behind her sternum. Now the surgery was done. His name sat at the top of the chart. Soren Dravanis. She had finished medical school with a child on her hip and no sleep in her veins. Every letter before her name had been earned with a ferocity born entirely of survival. And now he was here. Not by choice. By 3 bullets and the geography of a highway that routed through her hospital's coverage zone. She stepped inside, checked the IV drip, adjusted the monitors. Precise, economical, practiced. She did not look at his face. She looked at data, at numbers, at proof. Then his eyes opened. Not slowly, not with the groggy confusion of most patients. His eyes opened the way a lock turns, complete awareness arriving in a single frame. Gray eyes that had once made her believe she was the only person in any room he entered. He saw the ceiling, then the monitors, then her. For 3 full seconds, nothing moved. Everything suspended between recognition and understanding. His lips parted. Cracked, dry, stripped of every weapon his voice had ever carried. Marin. Her name in his mouth felt like a door being forced open in a house she had boarded shut. She did not react, did not flinch. Movement meant feeling, and feeling was not something she could afford here. Mr. Dravanis. Calm, clinical. You were brought in with 3 gunshot wounds. You have had surgery. You are stable. I will be overseeing your recovery. Something moved behind his eyes, vast and urgent, something she recognized but refused to meet. Your doctor, she finished, and the word landed between them like a wall. That is all. She turned before he could speak again. Steps measured, breathing controlled, hands steady. She made it past the guards, past the nurse who saw nothing unusual, past the break room to the corridor junction near the parking garage. Then she stopped, pulled out her phone, pressed a number that answered on the first ring. Is she asleep? her voice barely a whisper, and for the first time since the gurney had crashed through her doors, something cracked in it. A pause. A long breath. "Don't bring Sarah to the hospital this week. Not for any reason." She closed her eyes, back pressed against cold tile, free hand flat against her chest as if holding something together from the inside. "I'll explain later. Just keep her home." She hung up, stood in silence, one hand still on her sternum, because she had walked away from Soren Dravanis with nothing but a bag, a broken future, and a secret growing inside her that he never knew existed. And tonight, the hands that had just saved his life were the same ones that had raised his daughter alone. The night I lost everything did not begin with a warning. It began with music, strings and low piano drifting through the penthouse, settling over glass and marble and wealth that looks beautiful until you understand what holds it in place. I had been a different person then, not weaker. I was never weak, but willing to believe that love could exist inside a world built on control, willing to abandon the life I had been building, the textbooks, the residency applications, the future I had mapped out since I was 17, because he looked at me, and I believed I was the only thing he saw. I was 24 when I met Soren Dravanis. Third year of medical school, top of my class, focused in a way that permitted nothing else. Then he walked into a fundraiser I was working for extra money, and everything I thought I understood about discipline became irrelevant. He did not pursue me the way other men did. He simply appeared, again and again, in spaces I occupied, until his presence felt less like coincidence and more like gravity. I fell slowly at first, then completely. I left school. I left my apartment, my plans, and my carefully constructed future. I stepped into his world and told myself I was choosing it, not disappearing into it. That was the lie I carried for 2 years. The night of the gala, I was supposed to be at his side. That was always my position, his right hand, his visible proof that even a man who built empires on silence could be human. But I had been feeling wrong for days, a heaviness behind my eyes, a nausea that came in waves I could not explain. He kissed my forehead that evening, told me to rest, told me he would handle everything. I believed him. I always did. It wasn't true. The unease started small, a tightness in my chest unrelated to the nausea, something primitive pulling at me from a place no textbook had ever mapped. I told myself I was being irrational. I got dressed anyway. The dark blue dress he once said made me look like I belonged beside him, not behind him. The gala was noise and motion, faces performing the careful dance of power and politeness. I smiled. I moved through the crowd searching for him. He was not in the main hall, not at the bar, not anywhere the eyes of his empire could reach. I found myself climbing the private staircase, moving through corridors that grew quieter with every step, toward the wing no one entered without invitation. Our wing. Our space. The door was not fully closed, just enough gap for sound to slip through, for the wrong kind of sound to reach me before I could prepare for what it meant. I heard her voice first. Not his. Hers. Lissé, my closest friend since childhood, the one person outside his world I had trusted enough to bring inside it. She was laughing, low and intimate, a sound that does not belong to friendship. My hand found the door. My mind was already screaming at me to stop, to turn away, because knowing without seeing still leaves room for denial. Seeing leaves nothing. I pushed it open. He was there, in our bed. His body tangled with hers in a way that left no room for misinterpretation, no alternative reading, no exit. Her dark hair against his skin like ink spilled deliberately, her hand on his chest with a familiarity that felt practiced, rehearsed, not new. The world did not shatter. It simply stopped existing. One version of reality ended and another began, and the space between them was silent in a way nothing could ever fill. He saw me. His body stiffened, his expression collapsing from something dazed and distant into something sharp and horrified. Awareness arriving the way it always did with him. Too late. Marin. My name again, always my name, like it was a key that could still unlock something. Lisette turned slowly, and there it was. The detail that sealed everything. She smiled. Not guilt, not shame. A small, satisfied curve of her lips, like someone who had just completed an assignment they had been given a long time ago. I closed the door. Gently. The way you close a wound that will never heal properly no matter how carefully you stitch it. Behind the wood, I heard movement. His voice rising, footsteps accelerating. But it did not matter. Nothing he said could change what was already burned into my memory. I walked forward before he could reach me, before feeling could arrive and do what feeling does to people who cannot afford to break. That was the moment I disappeared. Not when I left the building, not when I stepped into the cold, but right there in that corridor, with his voice behind me and silence inside me. The woman who had loved him, who had left everything for him, who had believed she was safe, she stopped existing between one breath and the next, and what remained was something colder. Something that had already started walking. I did not run. Running is what they expect. Running is noise and panic and emotion, all the things that make you visible in a world designed to watch. Instead, I walked. Steady, controlled. The way you move when the ground beneath you has vanished, and the only thing keeping you upright is the refusal to let anyone see it. The gala continued below. I could hear it. The laughter, the music, the performance of people who understood that surfaces mattered more than truth. I moved through the crowd like someone who still existed. Someone nodded at me. Someone raised a glass. I smiled back because the muscles remembered what to do, even when the person behind them had already left. I reached the guest suite down the hall from our bedroom, the smaller room I sometimes used when the penthouse pressed too close. My hands did not shake as I opened the door. They should have. But some part of me had already begun shutting everything down, sealing compartments the way a vessel takes on water, closing off every section that could pull me under. I packed one bag. Not the clothes he had bought, not the jewelry that sat in velvet boxes like beautiful restraints. I took my old jeans, a sweater from undergrad, and the stethoscope my mother gave me the day I was accepted into medical school. I paused when my hand closed around it, the weight heavier than it should have been. Not because of the instrument, but because of what it represented. A version of myself I had folded up and stored away, like something I no longer needed. I took it. I took cash from the safe in the closet, the one he had given me the code to without a second thought. Because men who build fortresses never imagine the people inside them would need an exit. And I took my mother's ring. Simple gold, worn thin at the band, the only thing I owned unconnected to his name. I left everything else. His voice found me through the walls. Closer now. Sharper. Carrying an urgency that sounded almost like fear, but could not be. Because men like Soren did not fear the departure of something they had treated as permanent. The service elevator was 12 steps past the kitchen entrance. I knew this because I had counted once. On a restless night when I wandered the penthouse mapping every exit the way a part of me had always sensed I might need to. No cameras inside. No record of who used it or when. I stepped in and pressed the button for the garage level. The doors closed and his world closed with them. The descent took 19 seconds. I counted each one. The garage was concrete and cold and smelled of distance. His cars lined the far wall, dark and unmistakable. I did not take one. His vehicles meant tracking, and tracking meant capture. Instead, I walked to the service exit, A plain metal door opening onto a side street no one important ever noticed. That was the thing about control. It made you guard the grand entrances so carefully that you forgot to watch the back doors. The air outside hit me like a correction. Cold, sharp, honest. The city stretched in every direction, a grid of noise and light and anonymity that suddenly felt less like loneliness and more like oxygen. I walked 3 blocks before I hailed a cab, paid cash, gave the address of a bus station I remembered passing once, years ago, in a life that had belonged to someone else. I watched buildings slide past the window, the skyline rearranging itself into something I no longer recognized. Somewhere behind me, in a penthouse made of glass and authority, a man who had never been left by anyone was standing in an empty room, listening to the particular silence that follows when someone has chosen not to stay. I should have felt something. Grief, fury, collapse. But there was nothing. Just a flat, clinical stillness, the sound of something that had stopped functioning but had not yet been declared. I made one rule that night. One principle I pressed into my mind the way a surgeon presses a clamp against a bleed. Do not look back. Not for him. Not for the life. Not for anything that might slow you down. Because slowing down meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering his hands on her skin, her laughter in our space, his voice saying my name like it still meant something. And I had a bus to catch, a medical school to walk back into, and something quietly growing inside me that I did not yet know about. The future did not exist yet, but for the first time in 2 years, it belonged to me. The bus station smelled of diesel and indifference. I sat on a plastic bench with my bag between my feet and watched the departure board cycle through destinations I had never heard of, places that existed only as names on a screen, meaningless and therefore safe. I chose Dunmore because it was the farthest route that left before sunrise. The ride took 11 hours. I counted them the way I had counted the elevator seconds, not because the numbers mattered, but because counting kept me from thinking. Outside the window, the world rearranged itself in slow degrees, the city giving way to suburbs, suburbs dissolving into farmland, farmland stretching into coastline that curved and broke and reformed, like something trying to decide what shape it wanted to be. Dunmore sat at the edge of the water, a city large enough to disappear into, but small enough that no one with real power ever thought to look there. I found it the way you find most things when you are running, by accident, by exhaustion, by the fact that the bus stopped and my legs refused to carry me any further. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled of old paint and other people's lives. One room, a narrow kitchen, a window that looked out onto a fire escape, and a strip of sky too thin to call a view. But it was mine, paid in cash, no names, no questions. I unpacked what little I had, jeans on the bed, sweater folded on the chair, my mother's ring on the windowsill where the morning light could reach it, and the stethoscope, placed across the small table like a bridge between who I had been and who I intended to become. 2 days later, I walked into the admissions office of Dunmore University Medical Center. My transcript was 3 years old, but the grades were still mine, still proof that I had once been someone worth believing in. The woman behind the desk studied the gap in my record the way people study scars, noticing, without asking, 2 years unaccounted for. No explanation offered. You understand you'll need to repeat your 3rd year, she said. I understand. She watched me a moment longer, something shifting behind her expression. Not recognition of who I was, but of what I was carrying. The particular weight that certain women learn to conceal so well, it becomes invisible to everyone except those who have carried it themselves. Welcome back, Ms. Calvert. 3 words. They should not have meant as much as they did. But standing in that office, holding a re-enrollment form in hands that had once worn a ring worth more than this entire building, I felt something I had not felt since the night I left. Not hope, exactly. Something before hope. Permission. Permission to exist as myself again. I worked nights at a clinic on the east side, filing intake forms, restocking supplies, performing the invisible labor that keeps medical facilities standing after the physicians go home. The pay was barely enough, but barely enough was more than I had ever earned on my own, and there was a dignity in that I had not expected to find. During the days, I studied anatomy, pathology, pharmacology. Disciplines that demanded precision, that left no space for the dangerous quiet that grew when my mind went still. I buried myself in the architecture of the human body because the human heart had already proven itself unreliable. Weeks became months. Dunmore learned my face gradually, without curiosity. I was just another student, another worker, another woman moving through the world with her head down and her history sealed shut. At night, I lay in the narrow bed and listened to the building settle. Every creak was a footstep. Every car engine was a black sedan pulling to the curb. Every silence was the second before a knock that never came. He did not come. The fear did not leave, but it changed form, shifting from something sharp into something chronic. An old fracture that healed slightly wrong, always present, never fully settled. And then, on a morning in early November, standing in the middle of a clinical rotation, my body told me something my mind was not prepared to hear. The nausea arrived without warning, sharp, immediate, in the middle of a patient consultation that required steady hands and a calm voice. I gripped the edge of the examination table and smiled through it, because in medicine you learn early that your body does not have permission to fail in front of someone else's fear. It returned the next morning, and the next, each time stronger, each time harder to dismiss as stress or exhaustion. I knew the signs. I had spent 3 years studying them, learning to read the body the way a translator reads language, converting symptoms into meaning with clinical detachment. There was no detachment now. The test confirmed what instinct had already whispered. I sat in the fluorescent silence of a clinic bathroom with the result in my hand and stared at it like a diagnosis I had not requested and could not refuse. Pregnant. The word moved through me the way fractures move through bone, not with a single clean break, but with a slow, branching ache that reached everything connected to it. I was carrying his child. The man I had erased, whose name I no longer spoke, whose face I had trained myself to stop seeing in crowds, he existed inside me in a way that no amount of distance could undo. For a long time, I did not move. The faucet dripped. The fluorescent light hummed. Somewhere on the other side of the door, the clinic continued without me. Then I stood up, washed my hands, dried them carefully, walked back to my rotation, because the world does not pause for the things that happen inside you, and I had patients who needed something I could still provide. The months that followed were the hardest of my life. Harder than leaving. Harder than the first weeks in Dunmore when every shadow carried his shape. I was building two things at once now, a career and a life, and both demanded everything without apology. I sat through lectures with nausea pressed against the back of my throat like a secret. I stood through clinical rounds when my body ached in ways that made concentration feel like an act of war. I studied through nights that grew shorter and heavier. Every page turned a small act of defiance against a future that kept trying to overwhelm me. She arrived on a Tuesday in March, 3 weeks ahead of schedule, as if patience was something she had already decided not to practice. The labor was long, the delivery complicated in ways that tested everything I had learned about staying calm when the body refuses to cooperate. And then, she was there. Small, fierce, alive in a way that filled the room the way sound fills silence. They placed her on my chest and she opened her eyes almost immediately, as though she needed to see the world before deciding whether it deserved her. Gray. Not blue, not hazel, not any shade that could have belonged to me alone. Gray. The exact color that had once looked at me across a crowded room and rearranged the trajectory of my entire life. I named her Sarah. Not after anyone. Not as a tribute or a memorial. A name that belonged only to her. Only to this moment. Only to the life I was building from the wreckage of one I had chosen to leave behind. I held her in a hospital bed in a city where no one knew my real history, and I understood with a clarity that rearranged every priority I had. If he ever found us, he would not see a daughter. He would see a claim. He would see lineage. He would see something that belonged to his empire, not to me. And I would die before I let that happen. He did not begin searching the night she left. He began destroying. The penthouse felt wrong within the first hour. Not empty. Wrong. As though the air itself had changed composition the moment she walked out. He stood in the guest suite staring at the open closet, at the gaps where her things had been, at the absences that told him everything her silence had refused to. She had taken almost nothing. That was what registered first. She had walked away from everything he had provided and chosen instead a pair of old jeans, a sweater, and a stethoscope he had once seen her hold late at night with an expression he had not understood at the time. He understood it now. It was the face of someone grieving a life they had given up voluntarily. By morning, composure was no longer available to him. By midday, it was irrelevant. The man the Eastern Seaboard knew as the Sovereign turned the full weight of his machinery inward. Every guard questioned, every camera reviewed, every exit mapped and time-stamped until the footage confirmed exactly what he already feared. Panic had not driven her. She had left with precision. That realization carved deeper than anything else, because precision meant preparation, and preparation meant she had been building her exit long before the night gave her a reason to use it. He sent trackers. Men who had located targets in countries that did not cooperate, in lives that had been professionally erased. They came back with nothing. Not a trace, not a sighting, not even a rumor. Moraine Calvaire had ceased to exist, and she had done it without a single resource he controlled. That should have been the end. But Sorin Dravanis was not built for endings he had not authorized, and something about the night itself had begun to corrode in his memory, the details softening in places they should have held firm. The gala replayed behind his eyes with a clarity that sharpened instead of fading. The noise. The crowd. The drink someone placed in his hand that he had no memory of requesting. The way the room had started to feel liquid halfway through the evening, edges dissolving, his thoughts wading through something thick and unfamiliar. And then, the gaps. Blank spaces where continuous memory should have been, moments edited out in a way his mind refused to reconcile. He could not recall choosing to go to the bedroom. He could not recall reaching for Lisette. He could not recall anything between the drink and the moment Marin stood in the doorway with an expression that would haunt him for years. That absence. That hollow space where intention should have lived. It was what made him stop searching outward and start excavating inward. He began with the drink. Who had been near him when it was poured? Who had handed it across? Who had been positioned at exactly the right distance to observe without being observed? The answers came slowly, pulled from people who had been paid to forget, from records that had been meticulously obscured, from silence that only exists when someone has invested heavily in maintaining it. Lazar. The name landed like a blade slipped between ribs. Lazar Fennick, his head of security for 9 years, the man entrusted with every vulnerability, every blind spot, and every door that opened only for the innermost circle. Lazar had been near the bar that night. Lazar had rotated the private floor security 15 minutes before everything changed. Lazar had ensured the corridor cameras recorded dead static during the exact window that mattered. The betrayal was not impulsive. It was architectural. And behind Lazar, standing in the shadow of every manipulated detail, was a name that lowered the temperature of the room by several degrees. Kaspari. The Kaspari syndicate had never challenged him openly. They had never been reckless enough to try. Instead, they had done something more precise, more patient, and more devastating. They had identified the single fracture point in his entire operation, the one vulnerability that could not be guarded by weapons or territory or reputation, and they had driven a blade into it with surgical patience. Lisette had been their instrument, recruited months before the gala, positioned through Marin's trust, given access to spaces no outsider should have reached. The substance had come through Lazar's own channels, pharmaceutical grade, engineered to impair judgment and fragment memory, while leaving the body functional enough to be arranged in precisely the right position at precisely the right moment. They had not attempted to kill him. They had attempted to hollow him out, remove the one person who made him something other than a machine, and it had worked. The dismantling took 5 months. He did not rush it. The Kaspari operation collapsed in a sequence that appeared almost natural. Infrastructure crumbling, alliances dissolving, revenue channels drying up one by one until nothing remained. Lazar was last, not because he posed the greatest threat, but because he had been the most trusted, and trust broken at that depth demanded a response that permitted no ambiguity. He vanished on a Wednesday morning. By Thursday, his name had been erased from every record that mattered. Lisette was found 3 weeks later. The resolution was quiet, permanent. Soren stood in the penthouse afterward, in the same room where everything had fractured, and felt the weight of a victory that carried no taste at all. Every threat answered, every betrayal repaid. Every piece of the architecture built to destroy him identified, dismantled, and erased. And none of it changed the only thing that mattered. She was still gone, still breathing somewhere beyond his reach, still carrying a version of that night as truth that was, in fact, the most precisely engineered lie anyone had ever constructed against him. That was what kept him awake. Not the betrayal, not the conspiracy, but the knowledge that she had walked away believing he had chosen it. That the last image she carried of him was a fabrication she would hold as fact for as long as she remained hidden. The search did not end. It changed. It stopped being about territory and became something else entirely. Something slower. Something that demanded patience with no precedent in his world, but that had become the only currency left that mattered. Because if she had learned to vanish, then he would learn to outlast the silence. And outlasting, for a man who had never been forced to endure anything, was the closest thing to atonement he knew how to offer. The years that followed taught him a different kind of discipline. The empire rebuilt itself stronger than before, reinforced by the specific ruthlessness that comes from having already lost the only thing that mattered. Business expanded, territories consolidated. Men who once questioned his focus learned quickly that the sovereign who emerged from that year of devastation bore no resemblance to the man who had entered it. Colder, more precise, more effective in ways that made even his remaining allies uncomfortable. But the search continued. Through analysts who monitored digital footprints so faint they barely registered. Through contacts in medical boards, university registries, databases that were restricted in theory, but accessible to anyone with sufficient resources and sufficient patience. The irony, when it arrived, was so precise it felt designed. He was traveling south along the coastal highway, a routine engagement in a port city that required his physical presence. 2 vehicles, 3 men, a route driven a dozen times without incident. The ambush came at mile marker 114. A truck positioned across the road to appear accidental. 2 motorcycles closing from behind. The first bullet entered through the rear window before anyone could react. The second followed immediately. The third caught him as his body turned, tearing through muscle and settling somewhere deep enough that the pain arrived, not as a sensation, but as a slow, terrible understanding that his body was no longer under his command. His security responded the way they had been trained. Return fire. Extraction. Nearest hospital. The name of the facility registered only as a blur through blood loss and adrenaline, and the particular fury of a man who recognized the signature of this attack. Kaspari. A remnant he had missed. The emergency department at Dunmore Regional Medical Center received the call at 2:07 a.m. By 2:14, he was on a gurney surrounded by men whose presence made the nursing staff deeply uneasy, bleeding through pressure bandages that were failing faster than they could be replaced. He did not know where he was. He did not know whose hospital this was. He did not know that the trauma surgeon being paged from the third floor was the woman he had spent 6 years trying to find. The surgery lasted 4 hours. He was unconscious for all of it, held in a darkness without edges while her hands worked inside his chest, extracting metal, repairing tissue, returning a heartbeat to a rhythm it had been losing. Awareness returned the way it always did with him. Not gradually, completely. One moment, nothing. The next, everything. Ceiling, monitors, the antiseptic taste of air that belonged to hospitals and places where control was something that happened to you, not something you wielded. Then her. She stood near the bed, chart in her hands, her posture carrying authority earned through years of training. Her hair was different. Her face had changed, sharpened by years spent building instead of bending. She wore a white coat with a name embroidered on it, and the name was not the one he had been searching for. But her eyes were unmistakable. His mind rejected it first, tried to reclassify her as a hallucination, a side effect of anesthesia, a projection from a brain that had been searching for this face in every room it entered. She was real. Marin. Her name left him carrying 6 years of silence in 2 syllables. She gave him nothing. The same clinical speech. The same wall built from professionalism and placed between them with the precision of someone who had rehearsed for this moment in every nightmare she had ever survived. "Your doctor," she said. "That is all." She left. The door closed with a softness that sounded louder than anything he had ever heard. He lay there, heart straining against stitches that were not ready for the pressure, processing what should have been impossible. She was alive. She was here, not hiding in shadows, not living in fear, but standing in scrubs and authority, carrying a title that outranked every name he had ever held. She had rebuilt herself into something his empire could not reach, could not purchase, and could not command. And she had just saved his life. When the nurse arrived, he spoke with the deliberate clarity of a man who understood that the next words out of his mouth would determine everything. "I will be extending my stay in this facility, indefinitely." The nurse hesitated. "Tell Dr. Calvert that her patient is not going anywhere." She treated him the way she treated every patient in that ward. That was the particular cruelty of it, and he suspected she knew exactly what she was doing. Every morning at 7:15, she entered room 714 with the same measured stride, the same clipboard, the same expression that gave him nothing. She checked his vitals, reviewed surgical sites, adjusted medications when the data required it, asked clinical questions in a voice that could have been addressing anybody in any bed. Any pain on a scale of 1 to 10. "How is your breathing?" "I am adjusting your anticoagulant. You may notice mild bruising." She never used his first name, never held his gaze longer than assessment required, never allowed a single pause that might expand into something resembling conversation. Professionalism had become her fortress, and she maintained it with the discipline of someone who understood precisely what would happen if it fell. He complied, answered her questions, followed her instructions, did not push, did not demand, did not attempt to use the weight of who he was to collapse the distance she had constructed. His men were confused at first, then alarmed. The sovereign did not remain in places he could leave. He did not submit to authority he had not sanctioned. He certainly did not occupy a hospital bed for days stretching into a second week, while an empire waited for his return. He told them nothing. What would they have understood? They would have offered solutions, extraction, pressure. Instruments of a world with no application here. Because here, she held rank that no amount of power could override. And being powerless did not feel like defeat. It felt like proximity. He watched her the way he once watched rivals across negotiation tables, not for weakness, but for truth. The way she held the stethoscope, carefully, like something earned at great cost. The way she spoke to nurses, warm but never soft, carrying authority without performing it. The way she moved through the ward like someone rebuilt from the foundation up, every beam load-bearing, and every wall deliberate. She was not the woman who had left his penthouse. That woman had been brilliant but unfinished, still allowing his world to define the borders of her own. This woman had no unfinished edges. She had completed herself in his absence, and the result was someone who did not need him, did not fear him, and owed him nothing beyond adequate medical care. That realization should have discouraged him. Instead, it deepened everything he had carried into something that no longer resembled obsession, but something closer to reverence. On the 8th day, they moved him for imaging. Routine scans, a wheelchair pushed through corridors that smelled of floor polish and quiet procedure. The route passed the physician offices on the 2nd floor, a row of doors with small nameplates and narrow windows. Hers was slightly open. He did not ask the orderly to stop. He simply turned his head as they passed, a reflex, and in the 2 seconds the doorway was visible, his eyes absorbed what they could. A desk, a lamp, medical journals stacked neatly, and on the wall behind her chair, taped at a height that suggested small hands had placed it there, a drawing, crayon on construction paper, a house, a tree, a figure in a white coat with a circle of dark hair and a smile too wide for the face. And in the bottom corner, written in the unsteady letters of a child still learning how to make words sit straight, a name, Sarah. His hand tightened on the armrest. The orderly noticed nothing. The corridor continued. The moment passed like any other. But the name did not pass. It stayed, settling into the space behind his ribs where 6 years of absence had carved out a cavity he had never been able to fill. That evening, he lay in the dark of room 714 and listened to the hospital breathing around him. Somewhere in this city, a child had drawn a picture of her mother and signed it with a name he had never heard. A child whose age, if his mind was calculating correctly, aligned with a timeline that ended in a penthouse he could no longer stand to enter. He did not have confirmation. He had no proof. Just a name on a drawing and the specific mathematics of absence. But certainty had never been a requirement for the things that mattered most. He stared at the ceiling and felt something shift inside him that he had not experienced in a very long time. Not anger, not strategy. Something quieter and infinitely more dangerous. Hope. It happened on the 11th night. Not because he planned it, but because the silence between them had accumulated enough weight to finally fracture under its own pressure. She came for a late check, standard post-operative monitoring, but the ward was emptier than normal, the corridor still, and the particular hush that settles over hospitals when even the emergencies pause. She checked his vitals without speaking. Blood pressure, oxygen levels, wound assessment. Her hands moving with the same clinical efficiency that had governed every interaction since his arrival. "You have a daughter." He said it quietly, not as an accusation, not as a claim, as a fact spoken by someone who had carried the question long enough that the answer no longer surprised him. Her hands stopped. Just for a fraction of a second, barely visible, but he had spent his life reading people in the spaces between their movements, and that fraction told him everything. "That is not your concern," she said, resuming the examination as if the air between them had not just changed temperature. "She has my eyes." He had not seen the child. He had seen a name on a drawing and calculated a timeline. But the certainty in his voice came from somewhere deeper than evidence. Marin straightened slowly. The clipboard lowered to her side, and the clinical mask shifted just enough for him to see what lived beneath it. Not fear, not anger. Something more layered. The expression of someone standing on ground that had just moved. "You don't get to do this," she said, her voice low, controlled, carrying an edge that had not been there before. "You don't get to lie in my hospital and reach into my life like it still belongs to you." "I am not reaching. I am asking." "You lost the right to ask when you chose her over me." The words landed precisely where she aimed them. He absorbed them without flinching, because this moment required something more valuable than comfort. "What you saw that night was not what happened. I saw enough. You saw what they needed you to see." Silence. The monitors held their rhythm. Down the corridor, a door closed softly. "I was drugged," he said, "a compound engineered to impair decision-making and fragment memory while leaving motor function intact. Pharmaceutical grade, administered through a drink handed to me at the gala by a man I had trusted for 9 years." She did not respond immediately, but he saw the shift in her posture, the tightening of her jaw, the faint narrowing of her eyes that belonged not to a woman hearing an excuse, but to a physician hearing a clinical description she could evaluate. "Lazar Fennick," he continued, "my head of security, was working for the Kaspari Syndicate. He adjusted the floor security rotation. He disabled the corridor cameras. He created the window. And Lisette?" He paused, her name carrying a specific gravity in this room. "Lisette was recruited by Kaspari months before the gala. Through your friendship, she accessed spaces no outsider should have reached. The entire operation was designed to accomplish one thing: make you leave. Remove the one element in my life that could not be defended by the structures I had built." She was silent for a long time. Long enough for the monitors to cycle through several readings. Long enough for the fluorescent light overhead to hum through a frequency that only stillness made audible. "That is a very detailed story," she said finally. "It is not a story. It is a forensic reconstruction that took 5 months and cost more than most conflicts." "And you expect me to believe it because you say so?" "No," he said. "I expect you to evaluate it because you are a physician. You understand what a targeted sedative compound does to the prefrontal cortex. You understand how impaired consent presents. You have studied it. You have treated patients who have experienced it. You know that what I am describing is not an excuse. It is a mechanism." The words landed differently than anything else he had spoken. Not as an emotional appeal, as a clinical one. An invitation to assess the evidence using the expertise she had spent years constructing. She stared at him, and he watched the war behind her eyes, the version of reality she had carried pressing against the version he was presenting. Two structures bearing weight in opposing directions while the ground beneath them started to give. "Lazar is gone," he said quietly. "Lisette is gone. The Kaspari Syndicate no longer exists. Every individual involved has been identified and removed. I did not do that for revenge. I did it for the same reason you went back to medical school. Because some things must be rebuilt from the ground and the damage has to be excised first." Her breath caught. Once. Brief and sharp, and nearly inaudible. But it carried the weight of a woman whose entire foundation had just been questioned by someone who understood exactly how it was built. She did not forgive him. She did not soften. She did not give him anything that could be mistaken for resolution. But she did not leave the room. She lowered herself into the chair beside the window, clipboard resting in her lap, her gaze fixed on something beyond the glass that he could not see. And she stayed. Not as his doctor. Not as the woman he had lost. Just as someone who was no longer certain that the ground beneath her was where she had always believed it to be. And for him, watching her sit in the half-light of a hospital room at midnight, that uncertainty was enough. Not because it resolved anything, but because it meant the door between them was no longer sealed. It was open, just barely, just enough for something to begin. It did not happen all at once. Nothing that matters ever does. The days following that midnight conversation carried a different weight. She still treated him with clinical precision, still maintained the professional architecture. But something beneath had shifted. A pressure released not into warmth, but into something more honest, more uncertain. A fracture stabilized but not yet tested under load. He was discharged on a Thursday, 17 days after 3 bullets and an ambulance delivered him to her operating table. His men arrived with a vehicle. He sent them home. All of them. He rented a small apartment 4 blocks from the hospital, in a building that asked no questions and offered no luxuries beyond clean sheets and a functioning lock. The sovereign's empire operated remotely for the first time in its history, managed by lieutenants who understood they were not to call unless the matter involved imminent threat to life. Dunmore absorbed his presence the way it absorbed everything, slowly, without curiosity. He walked the streets she walked, sat in the coffee shop she frequented before morning shifts, existed in the geography of her daily life without pressing against its edges, not following, not surveilling, simply present, the way a person is present when they have decided that patience is no longer a tactic but a conviction. She noticed. She always did. 2 weeks after discharge, she found him on a bench in the park across from Sarah's school. Not watching the building, watching the trees. His posture carrying the stillness of a man who understood that the moment he stopped being still, everything he had waited for would end. "You cannot sit outside her school," she said. "I am not watching her." "I know what you are doing." He looked up at her, and his expression held nothing calculated, nothing strategic, nothing that belonged to the man the Eastern Seaboard had learned to fear. Just exhaustion. And beneath it, something unguarded that he had never shown anyone except her. "What is she like?" he asked. The question was so simple it nearly undid her. "She is 5, Marin said, and then stopped, because the words that followed required a kind of surrender she had not planned for. "She is stubborn. She asks too many questions. She refuses bedtime and loves thunderstorms, and she looks at the world like she is trying to diagnose it." Something crossed his face that he could not control. "She has your eyes," Marin said, quieter now. "Every time she looks at me, I see you." He did not speak. Could not. 6 years of searching, of silence, of occupying rooms that felt like monuments to absence, and now this. A bench, a park. A woman telling him that his daughter carried his gaze. The meeting was not planned. It happened on a Saturday, 3 weeks after discharge, when the boundary between them had softened just enough that proximity no longer registered as threat. She brought Sarah to the park. Not as an introduction. Not as a ceremony. Just a walk on a morning that smelled of salt air and something growing. He was there, on the same bench. And when they approached, he stood slowly, the way you rise when the moment is fragile enough that any sudden motion could shatter it. Sarah looked at him, not with fear, not with recognition, but with the clear measuring curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to be cautious with strangers. "You are tall," she said. His throat closed. His hands trembled at his sides, the same hands that had built empires and ended conflicts, shaking because a 5-year-old girl with gray eyes had spoken 2 words to him. "I am," he managed. "My mama is a doctor," Sarah informed him, as if presenting the most important credential in existence. "I know," he said. "She saved my life." Sarah considered this with the seriousness of someone evaluating a significant claim. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to collecting leaves from the path with the focus of a person performing essential work. He watched her, and everything inside him that had been held in place by discipline and control came undone, quietly, completely, without any possibility of reassembly. Marin stood beside him, close enough to reach, but not reaching, watching her daughter arrange leaves by size along the edge of the bench. "I cannot undo what was lost," he said, his voice rough with something that had nothing to do with surgical scars. "I know. But I am here now." She was quiet for a long time, long enough for Sarah to abandon leaves in favor of sticks. Long enough for the morning light to shift across the park and alter the color of everything it found. "Wounds do not heal because you force them to," Marin said finally, her voice carrying the rhythm of someone who had spent years learning how damaged things mend. "They heal because you create the right conditions and then you wait." He looked at her. "I know how to wait," he said. And she almost smiled. Not fully. Not yet. But enough that he could see the shape of it. The possibility. The first evidence that the architecture she had built to survive him was not being demolished, but quietly rearranged, room by room, into something that might eventually include a space where he could stand. It did not resolve in a single moment. It began over months of quiet mornings and ordinary walks, and a child who decided, with the fearless certainty that only children carry, that the tall man on the bench was worth trusting. She brought him leaves, then drawings, then questions delivered with the seriousness of someone conducting important research into how the world worked. He answered everyone, patiently, carefully, the way he had never spoken to anyone, because no one had ever mattered this much. He never asked Marin to return to his world. She never would have. Instead, he came to hers, completely, without conditions, without the machinery of power, without the name that had once been the only thing he understood about himself. And in the end, the most powerful man on the eastern seaboard did not conquer anything. He surrendered, fully, without negotiation, in the only way that could reach a woman who had learned never to let anyone close again. Not because she forgot what happened. She never would. But because the man who returned was not the same one she had left. And the woman who allowed him to stay was not the same one who had run. They had both been broken and both rebuilt, and the new versions fit together in ways the old ones never could have. And between them, on a bench in the morning light, a girl with gray eyes arranged leaves into careful rows, unaware that the stillness around her was the sound of 2 people choosing, one breath at a time, that what survived between them was still worth building upon. Not with power, not with promises, with patience, and with time.